Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas Hockaday. We're so pleased that you could be here and share your thoughts with us. I'm now excited for this conversation around some really interesting issues and a really interesting innovation. Joining me for this conversation is Vishaal Bhuyan, the co-founder and CEO of Aanika Biosciences. Aanika is a biology-based tagging, tracking, and tracing system that can help prevent food loss and that are due to pathogens and supply chain issues that are a result of the climate crisis. So, Vishaal, I'm so glad you could be here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. So so that we can put everyone sort of on a level playing field here, what is your elevator pitch about Aanika?
So at Aanika, we use microorganisms, so common friendly bacteria that's already on everything, to tag and trace products through the supply chain. So by doing that, if you think of microbes almost as this massive data set, we can track, a leaf of lettuce through from harvest all the way down to, the packaging, basically. So the idea here is, what does the world look like if we can remove the packaging, if we don't need to be reliant on the packaging to know all the relevant information of your food.
So microbes as a massive data set, that's sounds really complex and complicated.
It is, in a sense, but that's just what the world already looks like, right? So, pick up your hand, there's hundreds of millions of different, hundreds of millions of microbes all over you right now. So what we do is sort of use genetic engineering to drop a little watermark in the genome of these microbes so we can sort of direct that, right? So instead of the sea of different microorganisms on things, we've got something very specific that we can tag and then sort of fish out downstream. All for the purpose of managing risk of our food system.
And let's talk about some of those risks. I know you and the company are so concerned, as we all are, about the climate crisis. What does Aanika, how does this technology, this innovation, this genetic engineering work to help solve some of the issues that you care about, including climate?
So I think it's important to remember that, climate's a big topic, right? And it's very buzzy, but really the problem here is climate volatility. And so when you've got areas that are not used to certain temperatures, you've got a spike in different organisms, right? So for the last 2 years, we've seen the whole world being brought to its knees because of a virus, right? So it's the same thing with our food system. If you've got pathogens that crop up in places that just are not used to them, are not prepared for them, you've got increase in contamination, and then you've got an increase in our food and water system.
So, everyone hears about hurricanes or hotter temperatures. They don't realize that more diseases and pathogens are infecting crops, infecting livestock, doing all of these things. And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so actually the WHO estimated that I think just a 2 degrees Celsius increase would mean that roughly 5% of the world is more at risk for malaria. So you've got this exponential risk factor when you talk about kind of varying temperatures. And it's the same thing with our food system, right? So there's two aspects to it. One, again, a spike in contamination and pathogens just because the environments aren't prepared for them. And two, if you think about even stagnant water and flooding, where we're growing our food, that just results in more pathogens as well. And so traceability is going to become incredibly more important than it is now, and more than just a greenwashing thing, but all about managing the risk and knowing where and having more control over our food system.
Absolutely. And what kind of companies do you see working with you down the line?
So even though kind of downstream, it really does benefit the customer, we're working with producers and industry groups to really kind of implement and roll this technology out.
I wonder, because it is genetic engineering, is this a way sort of to get beyond all of the controversy that we've heard in the past around genetically modified organisms and other things? Do you feel like this is like a solution to a problem that, eaters and businesses and everyone can get around?
Yeah, I think you cannot be worried about the climate crisis and anti-GMO. To be honest, I think that genetic engineering and synthetic biology are critical in helping protect our food system. I think a lot of the damage a lot of the impact of climate volatility we're going to experience it. And so I think protecting our crops and having this mindset of, sort of kind of bad press and bad PR from the 90s affect our ability to make our food system more robust would be a huge mistake.
I want to talk sort of about the economics of this. When there is a food recall, billions of dollars are spent, by companies. Consumers are obviously affected. It can have tremendous, detrimental health impacts. Well, how much money can this sort of save down the road?
Yeah, so right now recalls are 2 to 3 times wider than they even need to be. And 40% of our food is wasted, and a lot of that's in spoilage and traceability issues. So we estimate we could, between the cost of insurance for a lot of these products and the sort of secondary kind of wastage costs, we think we could potentially impact our food prices by 10, 15, even upwards of 30%, which matters most to the actual growers and the producers, right, who are operating on razor-thin margins.
Absolutely. When we talk about traceability, I feel like there's this whole generation of consumers, of eaters who are coming up who want to know the story of their food. And I wonder how you sort of pitch the story of Aanika in terms of making sure that people understand what it really does.
Is that to consumers, you mean?
Yeah.
So, I think it's funny because, yes, it is, we use genetic engineering, but the other question is, do you want to know exactly what's going inside of your body? That's what you're eating, right? We, for some reason, think that the food that we eat and all the crops that we grow is just some, mystical black box, and we're trying to shed light, in that environment. So it's really about consumers wanting more transparency and more traceability. Well, this is how you get it. And I think you need to embrace new technologies in order to get that clarity, as opposed to just, you can't have, you have to have a broader perspective in terms of how we get to that end goal.
Let's talk about some of the global implications, especially for the global south, in terms of hunger, making sure that people, food safety issues are such a huge issue in the global south, and people are, fall ill all the time. How, will this technology translate to the global south in terms of being affordable?
So, we're leveraging technology that's already being used. It's not, there are microbes that are being used and utilized in food all the time, right? And so we have that as a core value of, our company and our tech. So it has to be affordable. We don't add more than a percentage point to the actual cost for our customers. And then more than that, the technology has to be easy to use, right? So practicality and costs are sort of at the heart of what we do.
Okay, so again, I just want to unpack this a little because it's such a complex issue. It seems simple, but it's also complex. How do you make it easy to use?
Our product is, again, we're using microbes. They're already being sprayed on crops. They're already being, fed to livestock. So it just gets implemented in currently existing supply chains. Whether that's being sprayed on in the field when other fertilizers and products are being used, and then downstream, it's just sort of off-the-shelf diagnostics that are being used already, again. So we make this as easy and simple to roll out as possible.
So for me, what do the diagnostics look like? What are you looking at? How does it work? How do you measure those diagnostics?
It's funny because 2 years ago, this would have been a totally different conversation, and now we're all running PCR tests and antigen tests on our countertop. So that's the exact workflow. It's really simple. Big food companies already run a number of different tests on their food. So it's really about identifying that little snippet of DNA that we've put in there. So if you think of a microorganism, its genome could be millions of nucleotides long. Our engineering is really just adding a 20 nucleotide barcode that we can fish out later. So it's just about getting right to that bookmark or that watermark, identifying it, and then being able to identify where that product came from.
And so when we're thinking about, we've seen so many disruptions with the global food supply chain. How do you see this working, regionally and locally for growers and producers?
I think this comes sort of from the top down in a lot of ways. So, I think this is really about the producers and the distributors getting more clarity and managing their risk again. So as opposed to, as opposed to them saying, what's the purpose of this? It's not just for the end consumer to say, hey, I know where my grains came from, but it's really about, a grower saying, we use regenerative farming, we do all the right things. Our product should be at a premium to people doing the wrong things, right? And farmers growing the food in the wrong way or in the unsustainable way. And so this is about sort of distinguishing that, again, coming from the top down.
Absolutely. So I want to take many steps back. So I wonder how you personally sort of started on this journey around food safety, the climate crisis. What spoke to you to sort of develop this?
So my background's actually was in finance. I spent most of my career in finance, specifically in risk mitigation. So looking at different systems and figuring out, how do we address these risks? Whether that's overfishing or water scarcity, we had a kind of a variety of things that we were looking at. And then I'd made an investment into a CPG product, so a food product that was sold around New York City. And we kept running into food and recall and contamination issues. And that opened my eyes to this whole complexity of our food system. And what I realized is that the food, I never thought about it this way, but the food system is just this huge point of vulnerability, right? So not just from climate crisis and contamination, but even from a national security perspective. It's just a very difficult and complex system. And so I kind of took steps towards, well, what would it look like to address some of these problems? And I'd partnered with my co-founder, Dr. Ellen Jorgensen, who was running a lab at the time. And we just came together and looked to biology to solve this problem as opposed to digital or kind of hardware technologies.
So it's so interesting that so many people come from the finance world and then get interested in food. But that's a tough journey.
Yeah, it's funny because on the surface it looks like this massive leap. But if you sort of look at kind of technologies that are adopted in the food system, the economics need to work too, and it needs to be practical. And so you can have these big, lofty goals, but they need to be, how are we going to roll this out? How are we going to make the economics work for everyone in the supply chain? And so then that financial background sort of helps and can help drive those goals.
And what have your conversations been like with other investors?
Our investors have been, I think they understand the bigger vision here. And the idea that what we're really doing is being able to take digital traceability, right? So barcodes, serial numbers, blockchain IDs, and bridge that with the physical products that they're supposed to tag. So, big companies like, Walmart and IBM are rolling out these blockchain systems, but what does that mean in terms of the actual product? And we can help bridge that gap. And our investors are on board with that, and they understand the impact we can have.
So one question, if I was in the audience, I might have is, isn't this solving sort of after the fact? How can you prevent pathogens in the first place?
So through biology, if you think of a microorganism as a platform, we can accomplish multiple different things. Tagging is just where we're starting, but we've also already made steps to create what's called antimicrobial peptides. Is one area of tremendous focus for us. So alternatives to antibiotics, for example, and we can tether them to our tags. So not only are they tagging something, they're preventing and making that product better. And so we look at this as the tagging is sort of a fundamental base layer, and then above and beyond that, we can create proteins to accomplish a number of different tasks.
What are you most excited about as you sort of look, for next year, the year after, 5 years from now?
I think it's rolling it out. We're doing a lot of pilot programs right now, and I think it's really scaling this out, rolling this out in real food supply chains. And again, I think the traceability aspect is just how we start, and the proteins that we're developing and the secondary functionality is really exciting.
I want to go back to something I asked you before and just dig a little bit deeper into it. There's at least, I mean, the UN Food and Agriculture Organizations has sort of different numbers, but there's probably roughly, especially right now with everything that's going on in Yemen and Afghanistan and of course Ukraine, there's probably around 2 billion people on Earth who are hungry, and many of them are suffering from food safety issues. And then we have all of these other sort of crises sort of coming down the line, and I wonder, what your vision is for sort of looking at this as a potential solution to all of these issues. Just like how will it help those folks who are living in dire circumstances?
I mean, I can't say that we'll solve all these different problems,
Sure.
that's pretty big, but what I can say is that just look at the trends across things, right? More data, better transparency means less waste. Less waste means you can sort of even the playing field, right? So I think if we have better control on our food system here, that means we've got more to reallocate to those who need it. And I think that's probably the way we'd be able to contribute the most. It's just bringing more data to the system.
We all know the stats about food waste. If food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. 40% of food is wasted, et cetera. I wonder if that also inspired you to really look into this, because there's so much of food is wasted, not just because of pathogens, but because of problems along the supply chain.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if 40% of any other system was going to waste, we'd be like, imagine if 40% of our bandwidth was the scarcity. We'd freak out. So, I mean, it's like the only big problem that affects literally everyone on the planet that, we seem to accept. And so that's a massive reason, right? And a lot of that, it comes from poor data. And we can solve that problem. And it's not that it's bad data, it's just like, how do you get data from something that's physical, that isn't yet packaged or isn't yet accounted for? And so that's really kind of in the spirit of what we're doing as well.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, for me, it goes back, it's hard for me to envision this in a way that, it will work all over the world. So, walk me through that process.
I mean, that's a pretty broad, that's broad, but really it's about, here's one simple example. All food and all agricultural products have insurance coverage on them, right? So imagine the insurance company going to the food producers and saying, look, you pay X to manage this, to write a policy on this product. If you use this spray, implement it in your supply chain, we'll charge you less. It's really simple. I mean, so they're different, that's just one example. They're different examples where someone in that supply chain can benefit economically from more traceability and data. Whether that's increased premium for a product where that supply chain is more sustainable, or lower insurance coverage, or a lower risk of a recall. So we find those critical points, and that's who we sort of appeal to and have them implement it in the relative aspects of the supply chain.
And do you envision yourself only working with big producers, or small and medium-sized as well?
We just think the best way to roll this out is with the larger companies and the larger food producers. These are just really complicated supply chains, and we need to have sort of stakeholders who have control over multiple points in the various supply chains that they work in.
It's an interesting question for me, because, again, it goes back to how do we solve hunger, the climate crisis, the biodiversity loss crisis, all of these things together. We need all of these tools, but making them accessible, I think, is important. And I want to sort of talk about that accessibility lens. How do you make this a technology, not a product, a technology that's accessible in lots of different ways?
I mean, that's sort of to my earlier point. That's by going to those who have the most control over those different points, right? We think that even though we might be dealing with one of the larger companies or the larger kind of industry groups, it touches downstream thousands of other kind of directly or indirect farmers, producers, retailers. And so we think that's just the best way to make this accessible.
And what if Aanika doesn't succeed?
I think if it's not Aanika, it'll be another company. But I think this is where it's headed, because I think you've got so many problems that arise from just not having that clarity into this system that somebody will fill that gap if it's not us.
And I want to go back to sort of the vision you have sort of later on for what Aanika can do in helping prevent things from food safety recalls from happening in the first place, solving other problems. What would be the sort of most exciting for you?
For me, I think there's down the road an ability for us to actually improve nutrition of the food we eat too. Right? We're seeing that with CRISPR technology and something called golden rice already kind of being rolled out in certain parts of the world where we can use genetic engineering and use technology to actually fill in some of the nutritional gaps. So I think that's really interesting. Today we're working on antimicrobials, but in the future there's no reason we couldn't be tagging something and making it nutritious for a group that's deficient of some type of nutrient.
And even though I think golden rice has been super controversial and gotten a lot of pushback, I'm wondering, again, going back to one of my first questions, how do you sort of fight that, at least in your own sort of office, that criticism that is going to come likely from the outside? I'm very familiar with this criticism, but you can't ignore just what's happening. I mean, the fact is we have a climate volatility problem. It's there. We have a nutritional imbalance in our food system, right? I mean, it would be great if everything was grown, not totally naturally and all of that, but that ship sailed like a long time ago. And so we try to, we're building for today and tomorrow. And so, we understand that there's a perception problem to a lot of this, but when you look at the actual data and the science, we're making things better. We're not creating a safety concern here. We're actually trying to solve those, these variety of concerns. So that's how we approach it, which is we've used technology to solve problems in literally every other part of our life. Why would we stop here, right? I mean, we haven't. We've taken half measures. This is actually safer than some of the other ways we've created our foods, right? So mutagenesis is more general and more randomized. This is targeted and just a better approach. Well, it certainly is an interesting technology. We're sadly almost out of time. Let's give Vishaal a round of applause. Thank you all so much. And now we're going to have a quick message from our sponsors. I want to thank all of them. This couldn't be possible. We couldn't all be here without our sponsors. And then I'll welcome back one of our previous moderators, Clarice Urbino. Thanks so much, Vishaal.
Thank you.